Today we're exploring the final chapter of Saint Francis of Assisi's life, a chapter that most people don't talk about because it's painful, difficult, and stripped of all romance. If you've been following these stories, you know that Francis is often portrayed as the joyful saint who danced with nature and sang with birds. And he was. But at the end, that joy was tested in ways most of us can't imagine. His body failed him. His sight disappeared. His strength vanished. He was dying slowly, in agony, nearly blind and broken. And yet, what he whispered in those final hours, what came out of him when there was nothing left, moved everyone who heard it, because it revealed what was truly inside him all along. By the time Francis reached his early 40s, his body was ruined. Years of extreme fasting had weakened him. Sleeping on the ground in all weather had destroyed his health. The stigmata, the wounds of Christ that had appeared on his hands, feet, and side, caused constant pain and bled regularly. But perhaps the worst suffering was his eyes. Francis was going blind. Not quickly, but gradually, cruelly. The world he had loved so deeply, the sunlight, the flowers, the faces of his brothers, all of it was fading into darkness. The blindness came from a disease he had contracted years earlier during a mission trip to Egypt. He had gone to preach to the Sultan during the Crusades, hoping to end the war through conversion rather than violence. The journey had been brutal. The heat, the sand, the conditions had damaged his eyes. And now, years later, the infection had spread. His eyes burned constantly. Light caused unbearable pain. Tears streamed down his face without stopping. The doctors tried everything: cauterization, herbal remedies, bloodletting. Nothing worked. Francis was losing his sight, and with it, one of his greatest joys, the ability to see God's creation. But Francis didn't complain, at least not at first. He continued to pray, to preach when he could, to guide his brothers. But those close to him noticed the change. The man who once sang constantly had grown quiet. The man who had always found joy in the smallest things, a bird's song, a flower blooming, now sat in silence, his face drawn with pain. Brother Leo, his closest companion, watched him suffer and wept. He asked Francis one day, "Father, are you afraid?" Francis paused for a long time before answering. "I am not afraid of death," he said. "I am afraid of dying badly." What Francis meant by that became clear in the months that followed. He wasn't afraid of the end. He was afraid of losing himself before he got there, of becoming bitter, of forgetting gratitude, of allowing suffering to harden his heart. He had spent his entire life preaching joy, poverty, and trust in God. Now he had to live those teachings when everything in him wanted to scream, to rage, to ask why. This was his final test. Not a vision, not a miracle, but the slow, grinding crucifixion of his own body. The breaking point came during a winter stay in a small hut near San Damiano, the chapel where he had first heard Christ's voice years before. Francis was so sick he could barely move. His eyes were almost completely blind now. The pain was constant. Rats infested the hut, running over him at night while he tried to sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't rest. And for the first time in his life, Francis felt despair creeping in. Not the kind that denies God, but the kind that whispers, How much more can you take?" One night, in the darkness of that hut, Francis cried out to God, not in anger, but in honest desperation. "Lord," he whispered, "help me bear these infirmities." And according to Brother Leo, who stayed with him that night, Francis fell into a kind of sleep or vision. In it he heard a voice, gentle and clear, asking him a question. "Francis, if in exchange for your sufferings and afflictions someone were to give you a treasure so great and precious that the entire earth, turned to pure gold, would be nothing in comparison, wouldn't you rejoice?" Francis, even in his pain, answered immediately, "Yes, Lord, I would rejoice greatly." The voice continued, "Then be glad, Francis, because the treasure I am preparing for you is the kingdom itself. These sufferings are the purchase price, and they are worth more than all the gold in the world." When Francis woke, something inside him had shifted. The despair was gone, not the pain. The pain remained, but the meaning of the pain had changed. It was no longer random suffering. It was currency. It was the final payment. It was the last thing he had left to give. That night, Francis did something that shocked Brother Leo. He began to sing. Not loudly, his voice was too weak for that, but softly, in the darkness, lying on the floor of that rat-infested hut, nearly blind and dying, Francis sang. Brother Leo asked him, "Father, what are you doing? You're suffering so much. How can you sing?" Francis smiled, his eyes closed against the pain. "Brother Leo," he said, "what else is there to do but praise God? He has given me everything. Should I stop now, when He's giving me the greatest gift of all, the chance to suffer with Christ?" In the weeks that followed, Francis composed what would become one of the most famous prayers in Christian history, the Canticle of the Sun, a hymn of praise to God for all of creation. But here's what makes it extraordinary. Francis wrote it while he was nearly blind. He praised the sun he could no longer see. He praised the stars hidden from his darkened eyes. He praised water and fire and wind and earth. He praised Sister Death, who was coming for him. The entire canticle is an act of defiance against despair. It's a blind man singing about light. It's a dying man celebrating life. It's a soul in agony choosing gratitude. Brother Leo later said that hearing Francis recite the canticle for the first time was one of the most moving experiences of his life. He said, "Father Francis could barely speak without pain, but every word of that prayer was filled with joy. It was as if suffering had purified his love to its essence. There was nothing left but praise." The other brothers gathered around him as he sang it, and many of them wept, not from sorrow, but from awe. They were witnessing something they had never seen before, a man being crucified who was still singing. As the weeks turned to months, Francis's condition worsened. The church leaders insisted he receive medical care, so he was moved to various locations, including the bishop's palace in Assisi. But Francis hated being separated from his brothers and from the simplicity he had always lived. He asked repeatedly to be taken to the portiuncula, the tiny chapel where his order had begun, where he had lived in a small hut with his first followers. He wanted to die there, among his brothers, in poverty, as he had lived. Finally, they agreed. They carried Francis on a stretcher back to the portiuncula. He could barely see the chapel, but he knew it was there. He knew he was home. As they carried him through the gates, Francis asked them to stop. He asked them to turn him so he was facing Assisi, the city of his birth, the city he had left behind decades before. And though he could barely see it, he raised his hand in blessing and prayed over the city. He blessed the people who had mocked him. He blessed the streets where he had once parted. He blessed his father's house. He forgave everything. He let go of everything. Then they carried him inside. Francis insisted on being placed directly on the ground. No bed, no mattress, just the bare earth. He said, "I want to die as I lived, owning nothing, holding nothing. Lady Poverty has been my bride. I will meet my Lord in her arms." The brothers arranged him carefully, laying him on the dirt floor of the little hut beside the chapel. They covered him with a rough tunic, the same kind he had worn his entire life. And Francis, nearly blind, his body ravaged by pain, smiled. He was ready. His brothers gathered around him. Word had spread that Father Francis was dying, and friars from across the region came to say goodbye. They knelt beside him, weeping, asking for his blessing, begging him not to leave them. Francis touched each one gently, his scarred hands trembling. He whispered to them, his voice so weak they had to lean close to hear. "I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what is yours." Then he added, "Do not weep for me. I am going to where I have always wanted to be." In his final hours, Francis asked for something unexpected. He asked them to bring him bread. When they did, he broke it and gave a piece to each brother present, just as Christ had done at the Last Supper. It was Francis's way of saying goodbye, of giving them one last gift, of blessing them one final time. Then he asked them to sing. "Sing the canticle," he said. "Sing to Sister Death. Welcome her. She is not the enemy, she is the door." So they sang. Through their tears, through their grief, they sang the prayer Francis had written in his blindness. They sang of Brother Sun and Sister Moon. They sang of the elements and the beauty of creation. And they sang of Sister Death, who brings us all to God. Francis, lying on the ground, joined them, his voice barely audible, more breath than sound. But he sang. To the very end he sang. As the evening came, Francis grew quieter. His breathing slowed. The brothers gathered closer, holding his hands, touching his feet, not wanting to let him go. And then, according to the witnesses present, something extraordinary happened. Francis opened his eyes. Eyes that had seen almost nothing for months suddenly opened wide, as if seeing clearly for the first time in years. He looked upward, his face transformed by an expression of overwhelming joy. and he whispered his final words. Words so simple, so perfect, that they've echoed through history. Welcome, Sister Death. And then he was gone. The man who had kissed lepers, who had rebuilt churches, who had spoken to wolves and preached to birds, who had received the wounds of Christ in his own body, who had lived in radical poverty and radical joy, died as he had lived, surrendered, trusting, grateful. The brothers said that after he died, his face glowed with peace. The pain that had marked his features for so long was gone. He looked young again, almost radiant. And above the hut, witnesses claimed they saw a great flock of larks, Francis's favourite birds, circling and singing even though it was evening, a time when larks never sing. In the days after Francis's death, the brothers struggled to process what they had witnessed. They had watched a man suffer horribly, lose everything, including his sight and his strength, and yet never lose his joy, never lose his trust, never lose his love for God. Brother Leo said later, "I thought I knew what holiness was, but watching Father Francis die taught me more than all his sermons. He showed us that sanctity is not the absence of suffering, it is the presence of praise in the midst of it." The Church moved quickly to canonize Francis. Only 2 years after his death, Pope Gregory IX declared him a saint. But for those who had been with him at the end, the canonization was almost unnecessary. They had already seen his holiness. They had witnessed it in the hut by the portiuncula, in the songs he sang when he should have been screaming, in the blessings he gave when he had every right to curse, in the welcome he gave to death when every instinct should have fought against it. Francis's final hours revealed something essential about the spiritual life: that joy is not dependent on circumstances, that gratitude is not earned by comfort, that love is not conditional on ease. Francis had nothing left at the end: no sight, no strength, no possessions, no plans, no future. Just a broken body on the dirt floor of a hut. And from that place of absolute poverty, absolute vulnerability, absolute weakness, he sang. He blessed, he welcomed, he loved. That's the legacy of Francis's final hours. Not that suffering is good, but that nothing, not even suffering, not even death itself, can separate us from the love of God. And when that love is truly inside you, when it's become your very essence, then you can lose everything else and still have everything that matters. You can go blind and still see. You can lose your strength and still stand. You can face death and still sing. The brothers carried Francis's body into Assisi for burial. Thousands came to see him, to touch him, to mourn him. But many also came to celebrate, because Francis's death wasn't a tragedy, it was a victory. The victory of a soul that had been tested to its limits and had not broken, that had been stripped of everything and had not despaired, that had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had come out the other side, singing. Saint Francis of Assisi lost his sight and his strength, but in his final hours, what he whispered, what he sang, what he gave to those around him, was the purest expression of who he had become. A man so filled with God that nothing else mattered. A soul so surrendered that even death was welcomed as a sister. A heart so transformed by love that suffering itself became praise. And when they buried him, they placed him in the church of San Giorgio in Assisi. Later, a great basilica was built in his honour, something Francis himself would have probably protested, preferring a simple grave. But the world wanted to remember, wanted to honour, wanted to preserve the memory of the little poor man who had lived and died with nothing, and by having nothing had shown everyone what it means to have everything. Because in the end, Francis didn't lose his sight. He gained a vision that saw beyond the physical world into the eternal. He didn't lose his strength. He found a strength that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul's surrender to God. And he didn't lose his joy. He discovered that joy isn't something the world gives or takes away. It's something that wells up from inside when love becomes all you are. That's what Francis whispered in his final hours. That's what moved everyone who heard him. Not despair, not regret, not fear, just welcome, just gratitude, just one final song of praise before stepping through the door Sister Death had opened, into the arms of the God he had loved his entire life.